Veta stepped into the vault with a caution characteristic of new hires in mortuary services. Yet the immediate sensation wasn't one of mournful respect or dignified silence. It was sheer physical pressure. The air inside wasn't cold, but it was heavy, as if her windpipe were being filled with liquid pitch. The walls, paneled in dark slate, reflected no light, seeming instead to absorb sound entirely, leaving an uncomfortable acoustic vacuum where even her footsteps were harshly swallowed. Yet, beneath that dead silence, Veta felt a constant, deep vibration. It wasn't mechanical. It was a low, profound frequency, nearly infrasonic, pressing against her sternum and stomach, causing constant, slight nausea. The feeling was akin to standing too close to a massive industrial press operating slowly, grinding material without ever emitting an audible sound. Standing before the basalt reception desk was Lysander Thorne. Lysander was neither handsome nor shabby, but an unsettling combination of both. His charcoal gray suit was perfectly tailored, but his eyes were not. They were tired in a way unrelated to lack of sleep. It was the fatigue of an ancient structure, having witnessed centuries of the same brutal, repeating ritual. He stood straight, but the sharp alertness emanating from him was not the welcome of a manager, but the hypervigilance of an explosive ordnance specialist. "Miss Veta," Lysander stated, his voice low and dry, utterly devoid of inflection. "You arrived faster than I expected, which is good. A disruption in protocol lasting mere hours is more than enough." Veta tried to swallow, feeling the tremor-induced nausea rising. "Director Thorne, I was prepared to replace Elaine, but I'm unclear. May I ask where she went?" Lysander didn't blink. He shifted to the right side of the counter, indicating a spot near the corner of the waiting room with a slight inclination of his head. "Your question proves you misunderstand the nature of this work, Veta. I am not a human resources manager. I am the chief Necrosanctioner, the enforcer of the dead sanction. My role is not ensuring a safe workplace. It is disaster control." He paused, his eyes scanning the entire room as if checking for invisible structural faults. "First, you must understand what this place is. Do not call the vault a funeral home. That is idiotic sacrilege. Funeral homes facilitate passage. The vault is a binding point. This is where death does not end. It becomes trapped. It is forced to exist under immense pressure until it purifies itself." The weariness in Lysander's eyes deepened as he explained the nature of his charge. He was not a blessing priest, but a sentry guarding a dam that must never break. "I have performed this ritual for hundreds of years," he said, "and in all that time there is no place for human compassion. Compassion is a loophole, Veta. A loophole is destruction." Lysander stepped fully away from the counter. He did not lead Veta to a break room or introduce the computer system, but walked straight toward the blurred spot she had noticed earlier. The smudge lay right next to the edge of a leather sofa set. It wasn't large, just an irregular, dark brown, nearly black oval. It resembled old, dried coffee residue or stubborn grease, deeply ingrained in the stone floor and wall, defying all cleaning efforts. It didn't smell, but merely looking at it filled Veta with a cold, visceral revulsion. Lysander pointed at the mark with a long, slender finger. "This is all that remains of Elaine, your predecessor." Veta frowned, searching for any sign of bone or blood, but it was just a faint, hazy patch. "Sir, she was bleeding?" "No, she was absorbed," Lysander corrected clinically. "A soul trapped at the binding point breached containment, absorbed her, and turned her into a vessel for its undirected fury. The absorption took less than 2 minutes. When I arrived, the Elaine vessel had vanished, dissolving into the energy matrix of the basement levels." He looked directly into Veta's eyes, preventing her from evading the terrible truth. The only thing left was the stain, a compressed residue of protein, keratin, and bodily fluids, You are not allowed to call this a bloodstain or smudge. That is Elaine's physical remnant. The ensuing silence was heavier than the pressure of the subterranean vibration. Veta felt her nausea intensify. She died, Veta said, struggling to keep her voice steady. She failed, Lysander emphasized, his tone dogmatic. She did not die. Death is a release, Veta, and release does not exist in the vault. She was crushed and consumed because she violated some protocol I suspect she was too stupid to remember. She became a flaw in the system, and the system corrected itself by eradicating her. Lysander Thorne turned back, leading Veta toward the reception desk. You see, your task is not order management or customer service. Your task is to maintain ritual control and ensure that, no matter the chaos, you never offer a vessel to the souls trapped beneath. He placed a thick sheaf of parchment, tied with solid black cord, onto the desk. In this dossier are the 4 binding decrees. These are the life or death principles. A violation of any single one of them will turn you into a physical remnant just like Elaine. A violation of all 4 will unleash hell upon this city. Lysander touched the surface of the parchment. It was cold as ice beneath his finger. Your purpose is to help me contain the pressure boiling beneath the earth. We are standing on foundations built from relentless indignation. You do not need empathy. You only require absolute adherence. The first decree, Lysander began, pulling Veta away from the chilling thought of the brown stain. It concerns the nature of the Stalker, the entity that absorbed Elaine. You must memorize this, Veta, for it is the most painful truth of our occupation. Lysander Thorne wasted no time. Having concluded his lacerating summary of the binding ordinances, he strode away without offering a word of luck or assurance. He headed directly for his private office. A heavy door unlocked but marked with a deeply carved symbol. A hand gripping a shattered hourglass. The dead man's sanction. Veta stood alone in the reception area. The air within the vault was dense, as if every emotion ever brought here had been pressurized, making the space heavier than concrete. Her desk was a massive block of darkly carved oak, positioned right next to Elaine's deeply saturated, dark brown smear. This stain was not fresh blood. It was the residue of a localized soul detonation filtered through physical matter, leaving a sticky resin fused into the wood and stone, impossible to scrub clean. She slowly placed her hand on the cold surface of the desk. Felt damp and brackish. Only hours earlier, a woman had stood exactly where she now stood, a normal human, before being dragged into the point of binding like a trap set for the soul. Don't look at it, Veta. Lysander's voice cut in from the intercom system, dry and devoid of feeling. Listen. What do you hear? Veta strained her ears. She had heard the low thrumming since she first stepped inside, a noise below the threshold of audibility. The sound Lysander had explained as the shrine of subservience grinding the suppressed wrath of 42 dead spirits. It was not a sound, but a pervasive, physical ache. The vibration, she murmured. Precisely. It is the muted scream compressed under hundreds of tons of charmed rock. Your duty is not to silence it, but to ensure that cry never grows loud enough to become a curse. Elaine failed to listen. You will not be permitted to do so. Lysander cut the connection. Veta tried to focus on the intake ledger. She knew she was required to be a pressure valve, not a repository of pity. She recited the ordinances. Allow none to die within. The sealing of the word must be performed. Eradicate the red impulse. Always speak the truth. Approximately 20 minutes later, the light on her console flashed. An intake alert. Urgent client intake. An outside voice boomed, amplified through the solid walls. This was a term Lysander had not covered. It was not a prepared corpse but an emergency transfer. Veta looked out the thick, frosted glass window. An unmarked van had pulled up hastily. 2 gray-uniformed Necrosanctioners emerged, wrestling a fast-response gurney. When the heavy steel doors of the vault groaned open, the cold external air rushed in, carrying the smells of ozone and acute panic. On the gurney was a frail, elderly woman, Mrs. Albright, according to the papers. Mrs. Albright was clearly in the final, agonizing throes of death. She was not prepared, lacking shroud or final rites. Her face convulsed. Veta felt a surge of revulsion. Instinctively, she stepped forward, intending to call a doctor or usher the woman into a warm holding room. But then one terrifying detail forced her to halt. Around Mrs. Albright's neck and clavicle, the skin was rapidly changing color. It was not the standard lividity of the dead, but a chilling blue-gray white, like flash-frozen ice. Asterisk the frost collar star. This was the certain sign of a soul already beginning to tear away from its physical casing, being magnetically drawn into the point of binding before it was fully departed. If Mrs. Albright died there, even if she merely crossed the threshold, only if she closed her eyes for the last time, her formless rage would be pulverized into the matter of the Stalker, and the vault would require a new container. Veta stared at the gurney where Mrs. Albright was rattling her final breaths. "Don't let her die here." Veta heard her own voice raspy, echoing Lysander's warning. The 2 Necrosanctioners braced the gurney, waiting for orders. They knew the law. If a soul was trapped, they would be blamed for insufficient speed. The vibration beneath Veta's feet suddenly intensified. The shrine of subservience sensed a wavering spirit. It was hungry. "Now!" Veta yelled, her voice stripped of any fear, replaced by a sudden, glacial urgency. She did not think of Mrs. Albright. She thought of Elaine, of the sticky, ossified stain on the wood. The 2 Necrosanctioners pushed the gurney further inside the room, right into the center where the point of binding was strongest. "Give the command!" One of the guards pleaded urgently. "She's running out of air." Lysander's words echoed. Asterisk you must throw the body beyond the threshold or away from the vault's containment barrier. It must be a violent act, breaking bone or inflicting injury. Asterisk. Veta bolted around her desk. She gripped the steel pushbar of the gurney. Mrs. Albright's lungs ceased functioning. The soul had begun to tear. "Stand back!" Veta ordered the 2 Necrosanctioners, her voice metallic and echoing. With a sudden burst of strength, she spun the gurney 180 degrees and threw her entire body weight into the push. The gurney slammed towards the exit. Crack! It struck the steel doorframe, and Mrs. Albright tumbled violently off the padding, rolling hard onto the damp flagstone just outside the physical threshold. Veta heard a distinct snap, the dry sound of bone fracturing as Mrs. Albright's body hit the pavement. It was a ghastly sound, a blatant violation of normal decency toward the dead. But instantly the frost collar stopped spreading. Mrs. Albright's body lay fully outside the effective range of the point of binding. She was completely dead, but her death occurred on the cold pavement, not on the chilling, consecrated ground of the vault. Mrs. Albright's soul, however painful and violent its exit, had been forced to leave rather than be trapped to serve the Stalker. The vibration beneath Veta's feet noticeably subsided, as though a convulsion had passed through the stone. Lysander's office door opened. He stood there, his long black coat still perfectly flat, his gaze penetrating. He showed no sign of disgust at the sight of an old woman's corpse sprawled on the pavement. Delay was 1.2 seconds, Lysander stated, not as a reprimand but as a data point. That is long enough for the soul to be frayed. Veta bent over, gasping, her hands shaking as she gripped the gurney frame. She had done it. She had chosen control over compassion. Why did the physical trauma have to be inflicted? Veta asked, her voice slightly strained. Wasn't pushing the body out enough? Lysander walked out, going straight to Mrs. Albright's body. He clinically examined the obvious break in her femur and her dislocated arm. The soul is pulled by my point of binding, Veta. The pull of the necrotic rift is immense. A peaceful death would allow the soul to drift in here like an unmoored vessel. Lysander explained, his voice chillingly academic. But a physical shock, a violent break, provides a sudden anchor. It is a terrifying marker, but it clearly defines the physical boundary. Your death occurred out there, not here. It forces the soul to be ejected. Your kindness would only feed the chaos. Lysander turned to the two Necrosanctioners. Return this body and proceed with standard intake preparation. She is now an outside deceased individual, effectively sanctioned. He looked at Veta, his eyes cold as steel. You do not feel guilt. You feel professional disappointment in your necessary actions. That is good. That feeling will make you faster next time. Veta felt the physical distress of the violent act settle, replaced by a brutal acceptance. She had passed the first test. After Mrs. Albright's body was brought back in under the new designation, technically, an outside corpse being transferred in, a more formal, discreet hearse arrived. The second client, Mr. Silas Galt, had died peacefully in his sleep, a death Lysander termed a clean death, a rarity. Mr. Galt was laid out in a hardwood casket, utterly still. This is an easy body to handle, but far more dangerous, Lysander warned, leading Veta into the binding chamber. A black slate room with a central marble workbench. Ordinance 2. The sealing of the word must be performed. Within every new corpse is a shroud of screams. Though Mr. Galt died peacefully, his spirit is still imbued with the panic of being trapped within a non-functional vessel. If you touch him, or even proceed with the rites without locking down that panic, chaotic energy will be released. Lysander pointed at the workbench. You must do this now. Touch his forehead. It must be a physical act to lock it. Veta approached the casket. Although Mr. Galt looked serene, as she drew near, she felt a fierce mental pressure, a screaming silence. It was the presence of Mr. Galt's soul, caught between the terrestrial world and the point of binding below, struggling to escape. Veta knew the rule. She had to touch his brow and speak. Asterisk, you are known. You are silenced. Your debt shall be settled underground. Asterisk. Lysander stood leaning against the wall, watching her without blinking. Remember Ordinance 4, Veta. Our pronouncements are not religious. They are the magic of the voice seal. Only perfectly spoken truth holds physical power. If you speak those words while your mind harbors doubt or mockery, or if you feel pity that contradicts the command, your falsehood will be seized by the space. Lysander's voice dropped to a near whisper. If you lie, the shroud of screams will fracture, and you will create the unburiable corpus. It will move, and it will seek you out to repeat your lies. Veta swallowed hard. She looked at Mr. Galt's pale face. She had to believe what she was about to say. That he was silenced, that his debt was owed to the vault. She could not afford the guilt of interfering with his rest. She raised her hand. The pressure of the shroud of screams made her skin prickle. You are known. Truth. She acknowledged his existence. You are silenced. Truth. She would enforce his muting. Your debt shall be settled underground. Truth. She believed he would become energy for the shrine. The moment her fingertips brushed Mr. Galt's forehead, Veta spoke the three phrases, imbued entirely with the cold veracity forged by her previous violent action. A current of intense cold ran from her finger, through Mr. Galt's body, and into the stone floor. It was a compressed sound, like the final click of a steel door locking permanently. The shroud of screams was sealed. The mental pressure vanished. Mr. Galt was now merely a body awaiting processing. Good, Lysander said, a rare note of satisfaction in his tone. Now Ordinance 3. He pointed at the pristine white shroud. We must ensure there is no red impulse left. If this body has any tattoos, Any open wounds that still contain clotted blood, or even a hidden red shirt, we must excise it before the next step. This is how, Veta, we stop their final violence from becoming our own. Lysander raised a hand, not to signal silence, but to punctuate an uncomfortable truth. In this field, death is not an endpoint. It is an energy transfer, and the vault is a brutal compression machine. If an unprepared body dies within it, that energy is bent, torn, and warped into an abomination we call the Stalker. This is the first binding ordinance, Veta, and the most difficult thing you will have to swallow. Our clients come here to ritualistically conclude their existence, but should they die before that ritual is complete, should their essence vaporize in the defined space of this binding point, they do not pass on peacefully. Lysander leaned against a stainless steel table, his eyes nearly closed with fatigue, yet his voice remained razor-sharp. He explained that the Stalker is not a ghost in the traditional sense. It is not the deceased individual's personal soul, carrying memory or sorrow. It is the purity of undirected rage, the last panic experienced as the soul is shredded by the pressure exerted by the shrine of submission below. Imagine a sponge dipped in water and then placed under a 1,000-ton hydraulic press. What remains is not water, but a dense, amorphous sludge. The Stalker is that emotional residue, left with only one driving need, the need for a vessel. He emphasized that it wants no vengeance, nor does it wish to be remembered. It merely demands a physical form to continue existing, a box of bone and skin to contain its invisible fury. And this is why the brown stain on the wall matters more than any paperwork you will ever read. Lysander strode over to the dry, paper-thin brown smudge on the plaster wall near the reception area. Veta had to struggle not to turn her face away. It was a vague shape, faintly reminiscent of a blurred human silhouette reaching out. That was Elaine, Lysander stated, devoid of emotion. She violated this ordinance. An elderly gentleman, while awaiting transport to the preparation area, suffered a catastrophic heart attack and died right there in the waiting chair. Elaine attempted to call an ambulance, a futile, romantic gesture. The moment he ceased breathing, the Stalker was formed. It requires no time. It is instantaneous. Elaine, in her panic, had tried to drag the body out of the threshold, but she was too late. Lysander pointed to fine, minute hairline fractures tracing the perimeter of the smear. The Stalker did not kill her, he corrected, his voice chilling. It absorbed her. It registered Elaine as the most conveniently empty box. What you are looking at, Veta, is the entirety of her bodily fat, muscle fluid, and moisture instantly withdrawn. She was compressed into a layer of ultrafine dust, leaving only a physical trace. The scent you catch in the air is her evaporated remnant. Lysander pointed to an old metal vent above the smudge. Her distorted voice still echoes in that ventilation system, occasionally. The Stalker is using Elaine's vocal cords to loop the insults and regrets it gleaned from the dead man. She is still alive in a terrible way. She is the physical casing for impersonal wrath. She is failure. He turned back to Veta, forcing her gaze upon the stain. Never view that as a personal tragedy, Veta. It is a control incident. It is a contaminated binding point, and we must ensure it never happens again. So, how do you stop a Stalker from forming? Lysander asked, answering his own question immediately. You execute the emergency thrust. This is our most brutal ritual, but it is the only thing that can sever the invisible tether the instant it forms. He explained that the death process inside a binding point has unmistakable physical signs, far removed from natural death. The first and most critical sign is the frost collar. As a person is dying within the vault's matrix, the foundational energy begins to draw upon their soul, preparing to crush it. This creates a slow, faint, barely visible circlet of pale blue color wrapping around their neck. It is not bruising. It is the physical manifestation of soul tethering. If you see the frost collar, you have seconds. The second sign is rapid dermal discoloration. The body shifts from pale pink to ash gray, not from blood loss, but from the immediate evaporation of life essence. The moment you identify any of these signs of passing, whether the client is simply gasping, or their skin begins to turn, all ritual, all reverence, all courtesy is jettisoned. Your singular task is to drive that physical body out of the threshold. Thrust does not mean gentle pulling, Lysander stressed. Gentle pulling is accepting risk, and the risk here is that all 42 souls below receive a sudden surge of energy from a nascent stalker. This action must be violent. It must be a powerful physical rejection. If the body remains intact as it crosses the threshold, the probability that the soul is still drawn back into the binding point is dangerously high. He described the technique with chilling coldness. You must grab the nearest point, be it ankle, wrist, or shoulder, and you must ram the body out of this space with enough force to break bone. A fractured arm, a cracked rib, a head trauma. This is not damage. This is physical confirmation of separation. Lysander explained that the physical agony, the material disruption at the moment of death, serves as proof to the shrine that the body is not allowed here. That pain creates an energetic trauma, a disruption that makes the binding process untenable. Remember this, Veta. Compassion in that moment means unleashing a catastrophe. If you are gentle, the stalker is born, and it will find you. If you thrust hard, you have preserved not just yourself, but the stability of the entire structure. He looked Veta directly in the eye, locking her gaze. You may face family, police, external indignation. You will say it was an uncontrollable physical spasm. We have all the legal tools necessary to obscure those injuries. But you must never speak the truth of why you had to be violent. Truth is a tool here, Veta, and it is guarded by me. Your job is the necessary action required for control. We do not sell serenity. We sell silence. And sometimes, to gain that silence, we must scream with the most brutal actions. Sector 9 must always be clean. No death inside. If there is death, there must be immediate physical structure failure, and that failure must occur outside the binding point. Accept this ordinance 1, or you will soon be a faint smear on this wall. Lysander Thorne wasted no time lamenting the death of his former employee. To him, Elaine was an engineering flaw that had been corrected. You are standing on a control failure, Veta. Lysander's voice was low and arctic, nearly absorbed by the continuous, deep vibration emanating from below the earth. The air in the vault was heavy, not with dust, but with psychic pressure. This was the reception office. This is where she stood, and this is where she vanished. Lysander pointed to a dull brown smudge on the wall and the floor, a spreading patch that looked like dried mud, but possessed an unnatural sheen. That is what remains of Elaine, Lysander said, devoid of inflection. She was absorbed by a stalker, a trapped spirit we will discuss later. When the spirit claims the vessel, it compresses the person's physical body into a dense, organic sludge. A clean, physical dissolution. He offered a weary half-smirk, a gesture of exhaustion etched deep into his aging face. Lysander Thorne, the director of Necrosanctioner, was not a funeral service manager. He was an enforcer of the dead sanction, prioritizing ritual control over human solace. The weariness was not empathy, but the fatigue of centuries spent battling an intractable physical force. You must understand, Veta, he continued, staring directly into her eyes. The vault is not a mortuary. It is a binding point. Death does not conclude here. It is trapped, forced into a new shape to serve this foundation. Elaine's death was a staffing incident, not a tragedy. Your mission is to ensure you do not become another stain. Veta dared not reply, offering only a sharp nod. She knew she had been hired not to comfort the living, but to control the dead. Lysander led Veta through a corridor of gray stone, where the temperature dropped noticeably. He stopped before a heavy steel door, secured by 7 ritual locks. "To understand the rules, you must understand where we stand," Lysander said. "This is a Lich-Rift. The physical laws governing death are bent here. Souls do not ascend. They fall." He revealed the gruesome history of the grounds. It began in 1796 with Archon Elias, a heretic cleric who had miraculously survived a failed sacrifice rite. Elias did not believe in absolution. He believed in suppression. When his 42 followers died in the chaotic ritual, Elias saw an opportunity. Elias believed the fury of those 42 souls was an exploitable energy, Lysander explained. He did not bury them. He used their remains, bone, blood, and flesh, to construct the specialized foundation directly beneath us, the Chamber of Supplication. The chamber's purpose was not storage, but crushing. It was designed to suck in and compress the ceaseless, grinding anger of those 42 sacrificed souls. This massive psychic energy was converted into a perpetual foundational pressure. That pressure is what caused the low vibration Veta felt in the air. This building, the vault, Lysander tapped his finger against the thick stone wall, is merely a shell of rock and cement. It was constructed to hide and control the seething power from the chamber below. This is not a place of rest. This is a pressure cooker we must keep firmly sealed. He turned, his severe face emphasizing the gravity. Your duty is to maintain that pressure. If any binding edict is violated, even in the smallest way, the pressure is released. And when that happens, those 42 crushed souls will be unbound simultaneously. It is an extinction event that I have been tasked to prevent. Lysander brought Veta to the waiting room where Elaine had worked. The waiting room was empty, yet the sense of oppression was most concentrated here. The first and most critical binding edict, the vault is never to be the site of termination. Our clients come here for preparation for binding, not for death, Lysander stated. He explained the brutal mechanics of death inside this binding point. Should a client breathe their last within the confines of the vault, their soul does not depart. Instead, it is crushed into an entity composed only of undirected rage. A stalker. The stalker has no objective, no memory. It is simply a flaw in the ritual, a physical need to materialize. It seeks only a vessel. Lysander pointed back to Elaine's smudge. Elaine was seized by a client who died in that chair. Her voice, distorted, like razor blades on metal, still echoes in the basement vents. She is alive, possessed, and serving as a secondary gateway to the rift. This led to the emergency protocol, the emergency thrust. If you see any sign of the dying state, rapid discoloration of the skin, the appearance of the frozen collar, a gray-blue ring around the throat signifying the soul is snagged on the binding point, you must act immediately and violently, Lysander commanded. The action was to physically throw the body outside the threshold or beyond the barrier door of the vault. This is what Veta must internalize. Compassion is the enemy, he said, his voice sharper than a scalpel. You must be violent. Break bones, cause physical trauma, ensure the physical body is expelled from the binding point. If you are gentle, if you hold the body in your arms for 1 second too long, that soul has time to form a stalker right in the threshold. Compassion in that moment is the equivalent of unleashing a catastrophe. Lysander watched her, ensuring her shudder was not resistance, but cold acceptance. Do you understand? If they are dying, you throw them. No exceptions. Now we speak of handling the deceased. This is where your ritual control begins, Lysander declared, leading Veta into an area known as the Stillness Chamber. It was not an embalming room. It was a space with thick stone walls and binding sigils carved into the floor. The air here was almost sterile, yet carried a scent of old metal and something faintly corrosive. ####Edict 2. The spoken seal must be applied. Lysander pointed to a stainless steel table. He explained that a freshly delivered corpse to the vault was referred to as a Screaming Husk. When a soul is forced to fall into a Lich-Rift, it is filled with panic and resistance. If you begin to handle the body, cutting, washing, or moving it, without the right of acknowledgement, chaos will spread. It is not emotion. It is the physical reaction of the trapped soul, Lysander explained. The mandatory rite asterisk. Lysander instructed Veta to practice. She must touch the forehead of the deceased, pressing her thumb firmly into the flesh, and state, without the slightest hesitation or whisper, "You are known. You are silenced. Your debt will be settled underground." 3 parts. The first, "You are known," is the acknowledgement that the soul's rage is real. The second, "You are silenced," is the act of locking the soul, forcing its quietude. And the last, "Your debt will be settled underground," is a ritual vow that this body will become building material for the chamber of supplication. Lysander instructed. Your thumb must be the physical nexus point for the acoustic lock. Consequence of silence, failing the seal. If you skip the spoken seal, the reaction is immediate and repulsive, Lysander warned. Without the lock, the body undergoes instantaneous self-decomposition. Within minutes, it turns into a putrid liquid, melting off the bone. But worse is the toxic gas released. This gas causes specialized auditory hallucinations. You will hear the dead person's final curses, their final lies, and their desperate weeping echoing in your mind. He paused, letting Veta absorb the horror of hearing a soul's dissolution in her head. Elaine forgot the spoken seal once, only once. She spent a week afterwards with those whispers in her ear. That is how chaos finds its way into staff. Ritual is not reverence. It is your armor. #### Edict 3. The complete removal of red impulse. Lysander shifted attention to a neatly arranged kit of tools. Obsidian glass scalpels and metallic instruments coated in an opaque white enamel. Now, Edict 3, concerning the red impulse, Lysander said, his gaze probing Veta. Red is not just a color in the vault. It is the most potent conductor for the impulse of desire, violent cravings, absolute regret, and pure wrath of the deceased. He explained that the human body, upon death, retains its strongest impulses in red materials. Blood, internal organs, and even the closest red threads of fabric. If these materials are disturbed before final ritual cleansing, they become infectious. There must be absolutely no red material, not a thread of clothing, touching the body during preparation. We must strip the red entirely before the real work begins, Lysander emphasized. The clot reaction asterisk. Lysander delivered a chilling warning. If you cut, puncture, or damage the body while any unpurified red material remains, the body will have an inverse protective reaction. It will ejaculate a clot reaction. Blood that has congealed and thickened like hot tar. It is not merely fluid. It is condensed impulse of desire, Lysander said. He recounted a brief, cold anecdote. A junior Necrosanctioner made the mistake of leaving a small smear of blood under the corpse's fingernail. When the clot reaction sprayed and touched his skin, the red impulse transferred into him. That deceased was a murderer who had killed his lover with a sledgehammer. He was possessed. Within 10 seconds, my staffer was running from the room, compelled to act out that dead person's final violent act. We had to use level 4 binding restraints to lock him into the chamber of supplication. He is still there underground, being crushed with the souls of 1796. Lysander concluded, staring down Veta. If this clot touches your skin, even a drop, you will be compelled to perform the dead person's final violent act. You will not resist. You must have no greed. You must have no desire. You must have no rage while processing. But more importantly, you must remove all red. He stepped back. Ritual here is not metaphor, Veta. It is physics. The spoken seal locks the auditory chaos. The removal of red locks the violent contagion. You are a tool of control, not a comfort. Lysander turned to her again, the dim light in the stillness chamber reflecting off his face. The final and most difficult edict. The curse of untruth, he began. Everything we do here, every prayer, every incantation, every oath, is vocal binding magic. In a Lich-Rift, veracity is a physical force. A lie is a hole in the ritual, and the vault abhors falsehood. He explained that when Veta performed the binding rites, she must genuinely believe the meaning of her words. She could not simply read the chants by rote. If you read a prayer you do not believe, if you scoff at it in your mind, or if you perform a rite you know to be false, the space captures that falsehood. The veracity energy in the room redirects. The soul is not put to rest. It is humiliated, Lysander said. The unburiable corpse asterisk. The consequence of falsehood was the formation of an unburiable corpse. The unburiable corpse is the reaction of a scorned soul. It does not dissolve. It is activated, Lysander explained. That body can move, it can speak. But it only repeats the lies, the falsehoods it heard from your lips. It cannot be buried, and it will seek out the one who spoke them. Lysander looked away, his voice tinged with old memory. I had to personally neutralize an unburiable corpse of a wrongfully murdered teenager. The previous mortuary manager spoke false comforts to the family and did not believe in the rite. The boy's body chased her for 4 days, repeating the trite comfort she had offered. It took ritual fire to finally release him from the falsehood. Lysander stepped close to Veta, his breath as cold as the chamber air. This is the crux, Veta. You are not paid to sympathize. You are paid to do the hard work, to crush resistance, to silence despair. Your shift begins now. There is a corpse waiting at the back door. A vehicular accident, rich in red material, he said. You must keep the 42 crushed souls below from ever hearing you tremble or doubt. You are our wall. Apply the spoken seal. Remove the red impulse. And never lie. Lysander Thorne turned, positioning himself between Veta and Elaine's brown stain. The light from the vault's old neon fixtures poured down, drawing his shadow long and thin like a needle. He didn't look at her but through her, at the wall that had absorbed the dissolution of her predecessor. This is the final ordinance, he stated. And it is more perilous than any physical threat. Ordinance 4, he explained, involved no specific ritual, but rather a state of mind. Understand this, Veta. The continuous low vibration you feel is not ordinary dirt or ghosts. It is truth. This is where the lies of life are stripped away. Our words, especially prayers or incantations, are not religion in the vault. They are voice-binding sorcery. Lysander raised a hand, unconsciously touching his heavy metal collar. The ordinances only function when executed with absolute intent. Only utterly sincere words possess physical power here. It is a form of clean energy, a propulsion force capable of suppressing the wrath of a trapped soul. He inhaled deeply, the air thick with sulfur and old preservatives. This place is an accelerator for truth. We are necrosanctioners, not hypocrites. Lysander stepped toward an iron table holding an old leather-bound book reinforced with steel. This was the register containing the mandatory incantations. We are sometimes required to read prayers of comfort, lines about rest, about heaven, or about release. You may be an atheist. You may believe in nihilism. It does not matter. What does matter is that when you touch the body and read the binding prayer, you must temporarily believe those words are real. Or at the very least, you must believe that the purpose of the action, that is, crushing the resistance of the dead and keeping the 42 souls below locked down, is the highest truth of this universe. He looked straight into Veta's eyes. Lysander's eyes were glacial gray. They did not reflect light but seemed to absorb it. If you read a prayer you do not believe in even slightly, if you are simply mumbling out of habit, or worse, if you mock it in your mind, even a momentary flicker of doubt about your role, you have committed the greatest betrayal of the system. The space captures that insincerity. The energy of truth in the room, which is meant to suppress, redirects itself, and the soul is not only denied rest but is actively stimulated by your mockery. Insincerity is not weakness, Lysander explained. Insincerity is a substance here, a type of visible toxic gas. It is a noisy interference thrown into a finely tuned ritualistic network. The result of this is the formation of an unburiable corpse. It is not the Stalker, Lysander said, his voice dropping like the grinding of stone. The Stalker is just undirected rage seeking a container. The unburiable corpse is different. It is self-aware blasphemy. He described the unburiable corpse, a physical body resurrected, yet devoid of the deceased soul. It is driven only by the energy of the lie it has heard, a terrible parody. The body might move, but its movement is not muscular. It is a long, low-frequency shuddering glide through the basement. Most frighteningly, it can speak. It will repeat the lies you spoke, the false promises of rest, the hollow prayers. It does not seek revenge. It seeks the speaker of the lies, because it needs to prove that lie is false. It needs the one who created it to lock down that contradiction. Lysander elaborated that an unburiable corpse cannot be buried, nor can it be cremated. It is a raw fragment of energy, anchored to the flesh, until it makes contact with the liar, at which point it executes a brutal ritual of its own, forcing that person to admit their insincerity. And that process usually ends with the liar being drawn closer to the shrine of submission. Veta swallowed, trying to process this sequence of ritualistic terror. She realized that every ordinance revolved around controlling the release of energy, not preventing death. Lysander seemed to notice her hidden skepticism and decided to offer a personal illustration. About 60 years ago, we had the case of a teenager. He was wrongfully killed, a death full of violence and regret. The attendant at the time, an older woman with excessive compassion, failed to comply with Ordinance 4. She felt guilt upon seeing the boy's corpse, and instead of reading the binding incantation with cold rigidity, she thought privately, "This boy didn't deserve this. I hope he can find peace without this meaningless prayer." She introduced a spiritual promise she had no intention of keeping. She introduced insincerity into the binding point. Lysander closed his eyes for a moment, as if reliving the sound. The unburiable corpse of that teenager formed. It wasn't a monster. It was a mobile, moaning object, repeating the prayer for rest in the woman's voice. It walked, not by lifting its feet, but by gliding across the stone floor, leaving trails of congealed bodily fluid. The task of destroying it fell to Lysander. He described the confrontation in the storage room. The boy didn't want to kill the woman. It just wanted the lie undone. But to do that, it had to consume the source of the insincerity. Lysander had to deal with the unburiable corpse using methods he chose not to detail, but Veta understood it must have involved an act of terrible ritual violence, far beyond the mandatory fracturing of Ordinance 1. "I had to uproot that brutal truth," Lysander concluded. "I didn't just destroy the flesh. I had to absorb the energy of that lie, accepting it as part of myself to ensure its power was completely knotted. I had to accept that comfort is a lie here. That is why I remain the Necrosanctioner. I am the only one willing to bear the burden of absolute truth." He pointed to his collar again. "This collar is not jewelry, Veta. It is a regulator. It helps me keep my words sincere, even when sincerity means brutality." Lysander Thorne turned back, his body obscuring Elaine's stain one last time. The instruction period was over. The air in the vault seemed to contract, making Veta's ears ring. "You are not paid to sympathize, Veta," he declared, his voice no longer instruction but a verdict. You are paid to crush the resistance of the dead. You are paid to keep the physical laws applied to souls that tried to escape judgment. Every action you take, from touching the forehead to removing the red impulse, must be a hard statement of control. He handed her a cold metal key. Your shift begins immediately. The register is on the table. Do not try to understand them. Just control them. He stepped back toward the heavy steel barrier door, a gesture indicating complete separation. Whenever you feel tremor, remember this. Beneath this floor, 42 sacrificed souls are listening. They don't need you to release them. They only need a small proof of your weakness, your doubt, or your insincerity. Lysander paused at the threshold, where the dark corridor light almost vanished completely. You must ensure the 42 souls below never hear you tremble. Your voice must be affirmation, not plea, because if they think they can get out, they won't just swallow you as they did Elaine. They will lift this entire building and bring chaos into the sunlight. The chime of the telephone in the waiting room rang, short and cold, the sound signaling the arrival of the first body. It was a jarring sound that cut across the oppressive silence. Veta looked down at Elaine's stain. A cold, absolute truth seeped into her. Elaine was not a victim. She was evidence of failure. Veta gripped the key tightly. I understand, Mr. Thorne, she said. Her voice was steady, a frigid sincerity newly forged in horror. Lysander nodded, a small gesture of brutal acceptance. He closed the barrier door, leaving Veta alone amid the smell of dried blood and the continuous low vibrational hum from underground.